we are here to talk about effective workforce development. So, Juanita, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. Welcome back from coffee and happy Filipino American History Month. I'm Juanita Soronos. I'm the head of Impact at Cengage, really focused on building strategy around workforce development and building public-private partnerships and how we can do well and do good. And I'm also the founder of Code Connect, a nonprofit where we focus on digital literacy and equity. And my windy path here, as I was telling Sal before, is that through private equity and consumer banking and into EdTech through tech education and trilogy education, and then now as head of impact for Cengage. So I never know where life is taking you, but super passionate about how we can build programming and educate people that need it the most to build economic mobility.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm Laura Hackala, Director of Online Program Design and Advocacy here at Magic. And I simply love the fact that so many of these sessions are centered around learner advocacy. I mean, it's right there in my job title. And for me, that's really what we should all be that's the question we should all be coming back to whenever we are doing anything for learners, whether we are instructors or if we are developing learning products or platforms, we should always be coming back to that central question: does it work? Is it achieving the desired or intended results? So I'm really jazzed that that's a really big focus of what we're talking about today. I am in content and curriculum development. I've worked across the entirety of the K-20 education spectrum, but my personal area of interest and focus is geared more toward higher education and adult learners and the unique needs of those populations. So, as I said, we are here to talk about effective workforce development. And workforce development is essentially any training or learning that is dedicated toward enhancing skills or tools needed for success in a given field. And this is something that's really important to talk about and incorporate into all learning, as you know, from K-12 to higher ed, and especially for our adult learner populations. So we want to kick things off with a quick poll to get everybody really excited about workforce development. Pulling up the QR code so that you can scan and join us when you're ready. Looks like we're ready for the question. What do you think is the biggest barrier to success in workforce development for learners? Options being lack of community support, limited access to resources, mindset and motivation, irrelevant or outdated content, or other. So, mindset and motivation. Looks like mindset and motivation are taking the lead, which very much aligns with what we're thinking and what we're seeing. Irrelevant or outdated learning content, that's definitely applicable to our discussion. The brave individual who selected other. I don't suppose you'd like to raise your hand and share what your idea was? Yeah. Time, great point. Yeah, that's especially centered around our adult learners, for sure. Okay, so let's jump back to these slides. And we want to begin our conversation by talking about what makes effective workforce development. So, Juanita, you and I have decided to break this down into kind of three different subcategories. We have support systems, which is obviously a big passion for you. Mindset, which we've all pretty much identified as being important to the learners, and then the actual content that we're deploying. So looking first at support systems, can you talk a little bit about the importance of coalition building and community support for learners?
Yeah, definitely. So it's essential because learning doesn't happen in isolation. And Julia mentioned it earlier, I don't know if she's still in the room, around universal design. So really looking at the communities that we're serving and how we're building for the people who are furthest from equity It really allows for us to meet the unique challenges of learners when we build coalitions, because now we're not assuming that we are the bearer of all knowledge and assets that are needed by our learners. And by bringing other people to the table who are doing really great work in their communities or at other organizations that might have services that will help our learners be successful, then we're all better for it.
Mm-hmm. So now, what would be the first actionable step there? We've talked in some of our earlier conversations about asset mapping. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how to approach it?
Yeah, how many of you have heard of asset mapping? Oh, this is great. Learning opportunity. So it's asset mapping is a framework you can use to identify assets in your community or wherever it is that you're mapping. So for us, when we're looking at workforce development, we're looking at, say, you're at Northeastern. Sal, I'm picking on you today. And you're trying to build a program that is really hyper-focused on your own market, what your market needs, your labor, your workforce. So by taking time to look around and see, okay, there are organizations serving the Filipino population, there are organizations serving refugees, and what kind of services do they offer? Do we already have a relationship with them? And if so, who's our point of contact and what are we doing with them already? So instead of thinking, how am I going to build content and teach it that also includes all of these things, but I have no idea how to serve those populations or what they might need because I don't have connection to them. Instead, you can identify what's already in the room and then bring them to the table and align on mission and vision and be able to build a better program that way.
Excellent. So now let's look at publishers or EdTech companies who are creating their own content. What advice do you have for those organizations in terms of coalition building and supporting learners? And I'm thinking in particular about the companies that are producing asynchronous content or who are producing it for a mass market, so they may not be directly connected to the communities where the learners are actually learning.
Yeah, and honestly, it feels like you're very far away from the communities that you're serving when you're in your own office creating the content, hoping that it's going to resonate with the learner and with the outcome that you're hoping to achieve. But I think that you're in such a powerful place because the reach that you're being able to have by creating asynchronous content for, when I was on returning from maternity leave and still trying to continue learning, being able to do that after the kids are asleep and when everything needs to be really quiet and I can't leave my full-time job to go to school full-time. Those are really important things. So as you're building that, I think using this framework of asset mapping, but instead of at an organizational level, thinking about it for the learner. So how can they look around and scan the room and be like, okay, who's gone through a program like this? Do I know someone else in my community who might have access to tutoring? Can I go to my local library and see what kind of resources that they have? Can I create a study group of other adult learners who are trying to go through the same thing, who also have kids? And I think putting that in front of them through their learning process allows them to step back and say, okay, I don't have to do this all on my own. And that in turn creates more successful outcomes.
That way they don't have to feel like they're isolated, even though they might be independent in that given moment.
Yeah, studying at 11 p.m. after a really long day of work and kids, you can feel very isolated.
For sure. So do we want to switch to mindset?
Yes, let's move to mindset, especially because it was very popular in the room. So encouraging mindset is really having an attitude of lifelong learning. It's obviously important for skill building, but is there a reason that it's especially important for workforce learning? And how do we create the right mindset to ensure success?
Yeah, so I think especially when you're talking about workforce development learners, it becomes important because, as you were just saying, there are going to be isolating moments. It is going to be hard. Your journey will be challenging. And so it really becomes a matter of, you're going to run into challenges, which we can approach in a few different ways. First, making sure that we have effective and engaging content to share with these learners, but then also encouraging them to think about their why. Why do I care about this course? How is it going to impact me? And the answers to those questions are going to be very personalized and individualized depending on who you ask. So it really becomes a matter of encouraging learners to start to understand why they're doing this and seeing that correlation between time spent and success. And then encouraging them to go back to that why throughout their learning, especially when it does get hard. It's almost like setting an intention in the beginning and reminding them to keep coming back to that as the content becomes challenging. And I'd also like to point out that if your content is well designed, it should naturally give them that why from the very beginning.
So when you're building that in, does age range matter? Like, for example, if we're looking at K-12 or adult learners?
Absolutely. And so when we talk about workforce development, there tends to be a natural tendency to focus on adult learners, and that's been a lot of what we've talked about so far, but that neglects a real significant portion of the learner population. But when we are looking at adult learners, it's especially valid that we do support them and their mindset. As the Lumina Foundation said in their 2021 Stronger Nation report, the vast majority of jobs being created require education beyond high school, and that trend shows no sign of abating. Now, when they say education, they are not just referring to a traditional degree. They're talking about, certificates and enhanced learning and, any type of education beyond high school. And so we definitely have to focus on adult learners and making sure that we keep the mindset in the right way. And like I said before, the best way to do that for that population is to ensure that there's a direct correlation between investing your time in this learning yielding the intended results. And then also consider incorporating workforce development content into your higher education curriculum. So think in particular about the learners who might be hesitant to invest in the return on investment of a higher education degree. If we can offer workforce development training as part of that degree, it might help encourage those learners to keep going. It might help them to see a more direct path between the time and cost of university correlating to success in the job market. Not to mention that enhancing that learning by incorporating workforce skills, it helps to solidify the learning, and it can take it to that higher application level of learning. But really, if we're talking about lifelong learning journey, we have to think at the younger grade levels, and we have to think in terms of starting the workforce mindset even as young as the K-12 segments. And in my opinion, that's going to be one of the more challenging aspects of workforce development, but it's also really important to focus on and there are ways to do so by making the learning tangible. Learners at those ages are very into tangible learning, allowing them to chase their curiosities and interests so that it's relevant and interesting to them. And really making the learning more social and communal, because that's how learners at those age ranges tend to find success. Okay, so we are going to shift into a new topic now, and in doing so, we'll bring up another poll question. Keeping you on your toes and phones out. Looks like we're mostly ready. So, what is the most important factor in creating effective learning content for workforce development? Spoiler alert, we're going to talk about content a little bit. Relevance to real-world skills, flexibility for different learners, engagement and interactive elements, continuous feedback and updates, or community involvement. No wrong answers. These are all really important. We're just looking to get a sense of what is the most important. Oh, early lead with relevance to real-world skills. Absolutely. I see where that's the leading factor here. Great. That will be talking about them too. Yeah.
So this is a great segue into the actual content that we're all deploying. What are your top 3 tips for creating engaging and effective learning content for workforce development?
Yeah, so my biggest advice when we were talking about workforce development is to take a competency-based education approach, because for me, there is no better way to meet the learners where they are. And so it really, it starts by allowing them to demonstrate their competencies and what masteries they have before they even begin the learning. So a really simplistic way to think about this is something as simple as a pre-learning assessment. Let's say the learner completely shows mastery of the first 2 learning objectives. Well, then allow them to breeze through those segments of the course so that they can focus on their own personal knowledge gaps. Whereas, let's say the learner sitting next to them doesn't have a mastery of those topics. That allows both learners to get a valuable and meaningful experience out of that learning module by not assuming any incoming knowledge that the learner may not already have, and likewise not frustrating the learner by having them spend their time on something that they already have mastery of. And then secondly, going hand in hand with that, in order to know what you have mastery of, and this is just good learning design in general, identifying clear and measurable learning objectives up front, and then making sure that all of your content and assets are tied and mapped back to those learning objectives. That's the best way to make sure that the learning remains relevant and on target for the learners. And then my third tip that I will share is that, usually y'all on a blank screen. My third tip is going to be a little bit more vague, because I'm going to say keep it as engaging as possible with the tools that you have available. So if you are developing digital learning content, keep it clickable, keep it engaging, add simulations and gamification, use badges to reward their learning and keep them moving forward. And likewise, if you're working with learners in person, incorporate a lot of creative brainstorming sessions or collaborative discussions, really, or maybe even one-on-one mentoring. So making the best use of the tools that you have available, depending on what type of learning you're working with. And now I will kick it back to you for either your top 3 tips or where you've seen a lot of success in terms of workforce content.
So definitely mentioned it earlier around learner empowerment. So really giving them the tools to be able to be successful. I think assuming, lowest possible exposure, and especially for our students who are receiving workforce funding, and knowing that they may not have any examples prior to this experience in extended education, higher education, anyone else in their lives, and going through this. So, being very clear and kind around the types of things that you can provide to them, such as asset mapping and career coaching, financial literacy, all of those kind of things. Not that they all have to be in your course, but pointing them in the direction where they can find it. And also real world application. I like that you're all on the same page with me, because the most effective thing that I've seen within the cohorts that I've been really close to is that if you're giving them a very abstract concept and being able to apply it immediately to something that's relevant in their life, they are much more likely to continue on. So, self-example, when I was learning how to code, I had 2 small kids, and one of the things that I designed was a Sesame Street hangman game. And of course, I'm like, oh, this is going to stick forever, because now I know that my kids are interested in it, and then I can talk about it with them, and how did I create it? And it just expands into like an impact that's not just the learner, it is now extending out into the family and the community. And I think that is something that can happen with all of the content that you're making and offering. And then that also leads me to community integration. And I think of community integration, not just neighbors, but also the industry that is around where they work and live. So how are you, depending on how you're creating content and delivering it, how is that something that either you as the learning provider or as the learner can then see how that relates to the industry that's available, what their labor market looks like, how they can then create economic mobility for themselves and for their family?
I'm so glad you said that, because really economic mobility and enhancing not only the individual's opportunities, but the kind of outward impact that has on the community. You know, where the individual finds more opportunities, they're naturally going to bring those opportunities within their community as well. So it can really have this outward trajectory of not just impacting the one, but impacting the many. And so with that, let's shift to outcomes and the all-important topic of efficacy. So I would love to hear your thoughts on why it's challenging to identify long-term outcomes of success in workforce development, and why that matters.
Well, first I want to know, has anyone in the room figured out how to track long-term outcomes? Because if you have, I would love to see your hands. It is my number one concern. And it goes back to efficacy, because then, are we actually reaching the outcomes that we're hoping, not just the learning outcomes that we've identified for that specific module, but if we're saying that we're creating this content so that they can have economic mobility, okay, they get that first job, awesome. What does it look like for the rest of their career? How has now that learning experience changed the way that they think about learning and allow them to come back to you when they're up for promotion, or there's a new tool like Notebook LLM, or Kelly was saying, practical, relevant, and timely. And I think a lot of that really is so difficult to follow. It's very important for workforce funding, specifically for WIOA funding and any of the other acts that have come through around inflation reduction. We want to know that we're using taxpayers' money in a very responsible way, and that the programs that money is being spent on is leading to good outcomes. So, really, come to me if you want to talk about that more, because it is the bane of my existence right now. I really want a better tool for this.
Well, so being the bane of your existence, do you have any suggestions to maybe guide the conversation in the right direction? Obviously not solve it, but help us take steps in that right direction.
So here's like an actual example. So thinking about the point that I made earlier with ties to industry. So not just learning for the sake of learning, but learning for the sake of economic mobility. The Inflation Reduction Act has a part of it where we're talking about green jobs. So what does green jobs even mean? And how does that align to actual jobs that are open in the market? How does that align to content that's already created that people can learn from? And one of the things in my conversations that has been kind of bubbled up is that a lot of people who are looking at obtaining that funding for training are looking for people who can install heat pumps. Does anyone know what a heat pump is? Oh, okay, all right. Not asset mapping, heat pumps. I know this room now. But heat pump training, do any of you have heat pump training that you've created? Yeah, weird. So it's definitely a need. And right now, a lot of the people who are installing heat pumps are going through HVAC training. And because of that, they're trying to transpose some of that knowledge into installing heat pumps, which, as you guess, it doesn't turn out so great sometimes, which then affects the end user of that heat pump, who thinks, okay, this technology isn't great, I'm going to go back to whatever archaic thing I was doing before, and then doesn't promote what that Inflation Reduction Act money was actually meant to go to. So if you're creating content and you're able to align with Mitsubishi, who's making the heat pumps that are being installed, to create content for these HVAC students, I think that would be game changing. So going back and saying like, okay, where are the holes? Where are we missing? And bringing those people together at that table to say, okay, we need this training.